Hey everybody, Philip here. I thought it would be fun to finally upload a video talking about my favorite albums I've ever heard, see if I can introduce people to anything interesting and new. Maybe you guys will have some unheard suggestions for me that I might enjoy too. Of course, I just want to say this list really isn't meant to represent the best taste in the world. It's not supposed to be full of the most amazing albums ever made. It's just a list of albums that I've listened to the most. It's a list of the albums that have the most personal meaning to me. Maybe I think they're really interesting from a musical or cultural perspective too, but these are not the all-time greatest. These are my all-time favorites. Number 25, Blonde by Frank Ocean. Society has become basically unrecognizable in the 6 years since Blonde. Blonde has started to mean less to me than I thought it always would. Even though it's pretty much a perfect album with experimental production, ingenious songwriting, and amazing meaning and beauty, it doesn't speak to me as much as it used to. But it is still a minimalistic and beautiful record and a once-in-a-lifetime musical achievement from Frank Ocean. Number 24, Pink Moon by Nick Drake. Nick Drake only lived 2 years after releasing Pink Moon, and you can hear it in the music. He was depressed for his whole adult life. He never achieved commercial success before he died, and he only released 3 records. But all 3 of them are absolutely beautiful. Pink Moon most of all. Pink Moon is under 30 minutes long, and it's really just a simple, minimal singer-songwriter folk album. It's just a guy with a guitar and a piano singing into a fuzzy microphone. But it's still more meaningful than almost anything else on this list. If you want to hear one of the deepest, most heartbreaking albums full of introspection ever made, you need to check this out. Nick Drake touches on themes of loneliness, depression, and the passage of time as he found himself permanently dissociated from the world around him. It's almost a shame that this record didn't come out in 2005 because I think Nick Drake would have become a cult hero and he would have ended up having a happy and fulfilled life of commercial success, unlike the life of obscurity and poverty that he experienced. But the fact that we're hearing someone speak to us on our generation's own terms for more than 50 years in the past is something really powerful. Pink Moon is a timeless album everyone should hear. Number 23 is In a Silent Way by Miles Davis. I'm not really knowledgeable on jazz in a meaningful way, and I think my taste in jazz is really basic, but In a Silent Way by Miles Davis is my favorite jazz album. I used to get a little claustrophobic when flying, and nothing really helped me, but one time I downloaded this album before the flight, put it on right as we took off, and I listened to it the whole way through without even opening my eyes. There's so much nuance and detail in a Silent Way, from the organs to the bass, the trumpets and guitars, with every element speaking to each other and themselves in a beautiful 40-minute long, unbroken musical conversation. You can just sit back and take it all in as the different elements take turns weaving a musical tapestry. It's a flat-out, unmistakable masterpiece. There's definitely a reason why so many people consider this an amazing record. I ended up feeling much better after listening to this on the plane for the first time, and I've kept listening to it every time I'm on a plane ever since then. Number 22 is Illmatic by Nas. For me, as a Gen Z hip-hop listener, Illmatic is one of the few 90s rap albums that I still listen to all the time. Some people call it the greatest rap album of all time, and I'm not sure about that personally, but it's a timeless story for me. It's jazzy, laid back, and easygoing, but raw and real at the same time. I've never been the most lyrical listener, so there are going to be some lyrical albums left off this list, but I really love Illmatic. The way that Nas was able to look at his experience growing up in poverty in a negative environment of violence and drug use, and focus his mind to the point where he takes a reflective, introspective attitude towards his own life and the world around him, he had the wisdom of a much older person. There's so much written about this album to the point where academic writers have compared Nas to Stoic philosophers and early postmodernists like Nietzsche. That's how you know it's good, when people start comparing it to writers from 200 years ago. You really can't beat that. Timeless music is timeless music. From the message of perseverance to the rapping and the beats, Illmatic is a perfect hip-hop album, and it's one of my very favorites. Number 21, For Emma Forever Ago by Bon Iver. Even though Bon Iver has that white millennial Starbucks association, I think he's had a huge impact in the music industry over the last 15 years, and there's so much he's worked on that you hear all the time and you just don't even know it. For Emma Forever Ago is an incredibly powerful album with a unique story behind it. While Bon Iver would later expand into so many different sounds, making a big impact on the hip-hop styles of the 2010s, For Emma Forever Ago is bare bones and simple, but it's incredibly emotional and devastating. It was recorded in a cabin in the woods where Justin Vernon stayed completely alone during the whole process. The final recordings of this album that we hear today were intended to be demos, but they ended up as the final version when Justin Vernon's friends noticed the potential they had. For Emma Forever Ago is a work of creativity, musical talent, and it's 100% a timeless masterpiece like most of the other albums on this list. Number 20 is Rodeo by Travis Scott. Not to devalue Travis's sound, but Rodeo was one of the first trap albums to cross the boundary from niche, local subgenre and kind of gentrify it. I'm not saying that Rodeo isn't a real trap album, because it 100% is, but it's almost a foreshadowing of the gigantic, pop crossover that trap would experience over the next few years. It's definitely in the Trap Hall of Fame. It's got incredible mesmerizing production, dark atmospheres, and the hero's journey storyline is amazing. Rodeo was a cultural moment that lasted for a really long time, and for me, it still holds up 100% of the way through. Number 19 is Without Warning by Metro Boomin with 21 Savage and Offset. Without Warning is such a good album that it's a defining moment for 3 different artists: 21 Savage, Metro Boomin, and Offset. There's nothing watered down or generic about this record, even though Offset and 21 weren't the most innovative artists back in 2017. I'm gonna give Metro Boomin most of the credit for bringing them together with some of the best trap production ever put to tape. It's definitely one of the trap classics. There's great chemistry with dark, sinister vibes, threatening, ominous synths, and booming bass. There isn't a bad song on here. It's menacing and captivating the whole way through, and I've been listening to it for 5 years straight. Number 18 is In Color by Jamie XX. Jamie XX's In Color is one of my favorite types of music. It's nocturnal club shit. With a very European sound, it's almost like the perfect introduction to house and garage music. It's pretty accessible and basic, but it showcases so many different styles while still being masterfully produced. Sometimes it feels bright and colorful, and other times it feels depressing and like you're alone with strangers in a room when he brings out the steel drums. Overall, In Color is a down-tempo, bassy masterpiece. Number 17 is Untitled Unmastered by Kendrick Lamar. Untitled Unmastered is the second best B-sides album ever made. It's supposed to be a plain, rough-cut, unfinished compilation of throwaways from To Pimp a Butterfly, but I personally ended up listening to it far more over the years than I ever listened to To Pimp a Butterfly. The instrumentals from Untitled Unmastered feel sinister and jumpy like a 1950s noir soundtrack on steroid, while Kendrick's lyricism is just as good as anything else on T-Pab. If these songs had ever made it onto an official album, it would be a much more chaotic sound than anything Kendrick had used before. He raps about hellfire and brimstone with a manic urgency as threatening double bass descends and saxophones swirl into a dreamlike hypnosis. Like I said, I've listened to this album more than I ever listened to Pimp a Butterfly, mostly because it just feels so raw and personal with the instrumentals being dense and crazy. It's just an incredibly dark jazz funk rap, and I don't think there's anything else like it. Even though To Pimp a Butterfly is more complex and more consistent, there's a grim atmosphere on Untitled Unmastered that I love, and I've never heard anywhere else. Number 16, At Long Last ASAP by A$AP Rocky. At Long Last ASAP is a record where every song is different. Every track is creative and full of non-stop style and energy. The project basically has infinite replay value. I've been listening to it for like 7 years now, and I'm still not bored of it. Rocky had so much versatility here. There are trap bangers, rock-inspired tracks, slow, vibey songs, and Rocky's lyricism and personality shines through the whole way. Even though it's an album from the trap era, it feels more psychedelic and timeless than anything else from those years. And I think looking 5, 10, 15 years into the future, At Long Last ASAP will be considered a classic from the 2010s. Number 15, Faces by Mac Miller. Faces probably isn't Mac's best record, but I think it is a culmination of every theme and sound he would later touch on in his career. It's a record that talks about the ways life can be confusing, frustrating, and overwhelming despite all the beauty around us all the time. The jazzy, psychedelic production is meditative, sorrowful, sinister, and victorious all at once, and Mac's lyrics are more real and raw than anything he ever made before. Songs like Colors and Shapes are comforting in their existential confusion. The project is full of serious, honest soul-searching. It's kind of crazy just how colorful and energetic it can be, while at the same time being so genuinely depressed. In the end, Faces is more cathartic than anything else. Plus, Mac's musical genius and personality is on display the whole way through. Number 14, 444 by Jay-Z. 444 is one of those very few times a rap star has come back after their peak and made an album that is not only just as good as his previous work, but in many ways even better than anything he ever put out before. 444 is one of the most mature rap albums I've ever heard. It isn't the same Jay-Z from earlier in his career. I'm not gonna say it's better than his old albums because it's very different, but at the same time, it's an incredibly solid project. 444 talks about themes of family, legacy, guilt, trauma, the afterglow of a superstar career as he looks at the ways in which he changed the world around him for better or worse. It's a totally different perspective on life from what we're used to in the music industry. He raps about family, children, his mother. This is a profoundly meaningful album from one of the best rappers alive, and I listen to it all the time. Number 13 is Windswept Adan by Ichiko Aoba. I think one thing this list has a lot of is very relaxing, calming albums. And Windswept Adan by Japanese instrumentalist and vocalist Ichiko Aoba is a tranquil record full of minimalist atmospheres that are transcendently beautiful. There's not one boring point on this record despite the fact it's incredibly quiet and relaxing. It feels organic and lush the whole way through. Ichiko Aoba uses strings, woodwind, melodic percussion, and even ambient soundscapes to convey themes of nature and water in a way that feels profoundly freeing. It's a rare album that can be both pleasant background music and one of the most beautifully composed, intricate records you'll ever hear at the same exact time. The minimalism of Windswept at Dawn has a profound sense of purity that touches on spiritual themes through the feelings of freedom and nature. I love this album. I'm always listening to it. Number 12, Untrue by Burial. Burial is a record with a really interesting backstory and an even more interesting sound. Falling under the dubstep garage ambient umbrella, it has a cold, detached industrial style that comes as a result of Burial producing the album exclusively at night. He later wrote about driving through industrial areas at 3 or 4 a.m., testing the songs and leaving the studio during the day to make sure that he only ever worked on the project in the dark. The end result is an album with a cold, dark, ethereal sound. It feels like it was written by a ghost trapped in the streets of London, watching life pass by through an eternal nighttime. Untrue is full of spiritual and political undertones, and in my mind, it's one of the best electronic albums ever made. The feelings in this album are unique to our age of technological symbiosis, in the way that Burial creates musical spiritualism through ambiance more than any recognizable composition you can point to and recognize on its own. It's extremely minimal, but at the same time, it's one of my favorite albums ever. Number 11, Heaven or Las Vegas by the Cocteau Twins. Heaven or Las Vegas is a beautifully melodic early 90s shoegaze album, and even though I've never been a fan of guitar-based rock music, for me this is something else entirely. There's definitely a reason why artists like The Weeknd have sampled this band. The guitar tones are ethereal, their vocals are angelic, and overall it's one of the most vibrant, otherworldly records I've ever heard. I've listened to Heaven or Las Vegas dozens if not hundreds of times, and I don't think I'm ever going to get bored of the pure, majestic sounds that they created on this album. The band's whole discography is amazing, but Heaven or Las Vegas in particular is a world of its own. Number 10, Bo Jackson by Boldy James. Bo Jackson is at the moment one of my favorite hip-hop albums of all time. Even though flexing money, luxury, and consumerism is an essential piece of the spirit of hip-hop, I've come to absolutely love rap storytelling that doesn't care about those themes at all. And in my mind, Boldy James is the king of that style. This is an incredibly dark, negative album that is really, really underrated. Bo Jackson's production is demented. The lyrics are maniacal, and the storytelling is like if Homer's Odyssey took place in the slums of Detroit. There is brutality on here. It depicts a life of crime in the most unflattering, painfully realistic way. Everything is dark, depressing, and cynical. Boldy James isn't bragging about his life of crime, but presenting it how it is, painful and heavy. There's nothing else like it. Number 9 is Meek Volume 6 by Knowledge. Meek Mill's best work wasn't actually released by him, but a DJ from Philly named Knowledge. Knowledge made 6 EPs remixing Meek's old freestyles from the late 2000s, a lot of which were recorded on the streets of Philly before he ever got in a studio. Knowledge adds the sounds of vaporwave, R&B, jazz, and hip-hop to Meek's hard-hitting autobiographical raps in a way that makes them feel even more poignant and urgent. This project truly reveals Meek Mill's actual brilliance and talent for rapping and storytelling. It's a bittersweet feeling listening to these raps over lo-fi jazz beats and knowing the success that Meek Mill would eventually go on to achieve. It's also a really interesting example of how production can change a project. There's also a rawness to Meek's storytelling that I think he kind of left behind as he got bigger later on. I made a full video about this series, and you can click on the link below if you're interested in seeing it. This is definitely one of the best producer-led projects I've ever heard, and it really helps that there's 7 different volumes of it. Number 8 is After Hours by The Weeknd. For me, After Hours is one of the best pop albums of the 21st century, if not ever, and it's by far The Weeknd's masterpiece. Everything from the storyline to the vocals to the production is cinematic and big. It's an amazingly complete package where The Weeknd explores the dark side of fame and celebrity, playing the part of a character who finds himself painfully alone after realizing that the people around him only wanted him for his fame and money. As he descends into madness, we follow him through some of the most atmospheric synth-pop instrumentals you'll ever hear. He worked with a long list of top-notch producers to create a timeless experience unlike anything I've ever heard before. Even the annoying mega hits are still really good on this record. There are no skips on After Hours, and there's no way that this doesn't go down as a top 10 album from the 2020s. Number 7 is Meet the Woo Part 1 by Pop Smoke. Pop Smoke's early music felt like the soundtrack to New York City as a war zone. Everything was combative, The stakes felt high, and his delivery itself had more aggression than any music I ever heard before. This is some of the hardest hip-hop you're ever gonna hear. When it first came out, it felt like a new era, and no matter what critics or haters said, if he were still alive today, I think he would be one of the biggest artists in the world. The UK production was menacing and grim and fresh, but his vocals weren't just aggressive. Pop Smoke was starting to make R&B and pop songs too before he died. I've listened to Meet the Woo hundreds of times, and Pop Smoke is always one of my most listened artists of the year. Meet the Woo is basically the defining New York drill album, and nothing that's come out of New York since then has ever been nearly as good. It probably never will be. Number 6 is Amnesiac by Radiohead. Radiohead's Amnesiac is their quiet masterpiece. It's basically just a B-sides album, but it's also so much more than that. It's disjointed, it never picks a sound to stick with, and I get why some people don't like it. Sometimes it's jazz, sometimes it's post-rock, sometimes it's electronic. It feels dead and alive at the same time, but that's why I like it. It's incredibly dark and nocturnal and heavenly all at once. There's a real tangible soundscape. It switches from vast plains to dark forests to indescribable balls of chaotic texture. This really isn't a B-sides or compilation album. It's a unique piece of music that stands on its own as a brilliant piece of electronic jazz rock. It can be absolutely chilling. If society judged music the way we do paintings, Amnesiac would be one of the greatest surrealist works of all time. It's much more nuanced, relaxed, and subtle than anything else I feel Radiohead has made. Listening to Amnesiac feels like walking into a dark cafe with monsters and villains at every table, but you can't see their faces, you can only feel the darkness of their spirit. It's by far my favorite Radiohead album. Number 5 is Random Access Memories by Daft Punk. RAM is the perfect music listening experience. It's disco, it's funk, it's soul, it's synth pop, it's progressive house, it's French house. Every single style they go for feels perfectly developed down to the tiniest details. It's full of moments of emotional depth and uplifting beauty, and above all, the way they mix digital sounds with organic textures is an absolute triumph of production. RAM is one of those albums that simply cannot be summed up into one sound. There's too much going on. It's one of the most lively and comprehensive albums I've ever heard, and like I said before, it is the perfect musical listening experience. I will never get over how beautiful RAM can be. Number 4 is Descendants of Cain by Ka. Descendants of Cain is a shining example of drumless hip-hop. It's a very grim, serious record that follows the recent trend of old-school sounding records that have been popping up over the past few years, and this album is insanely good. It's a story about growing up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, one of the most impoverished and dangerous areas of New York City, from the perspective of a man who later went on to be a high-ranking firefighter and create his own record label. The narrative is told through the lens of the biblical story of Cain and Abel, and Ka's lyrics here are on a level of their own. His rapping too, he almost talks more than he raps. He never raises his voice above an urgent whisper. The instrumentals are largely drumless and have a haunting atmosphere of wilderness with heavy sampling and vintage mixing. The subject matter is grave as he not only recounts the stories of the darkness he encountered in his youth, but he frames it through dichotomies of light and darkness, good and evil, with truly biblical proportions. The album is gravely serious as he raps, "I live this vivid shit. I ain't that creative." Lines like "I was raised to age a few years in a day," and "I saw Lancelots at round tables cutting eighths" give a sense of grandeur and magic to the darkness he was surrounded by in one of the hardest places in New York. Descendants of Cain is a very unique album. Ka is able to reflect his personal experiences in his very real life in an extremely stylized way. Every time I listen to it, I find myself just sitting back in awe at the depth he's able to create. Number 3 is Spirit of Eden by Talk Talk. Spirit of Eden is another late 90s, early 90s album in the art rock category. I mentioned earlier that I'm not a rock fan, but this isn't really rock music. It has guitars, keyboards, and drums, but this is a lot more like a musical puzzle than anything else. Anybody who ever wants to produce any kind of music in their career should have to listen to this record. It feels so ambient. The long, drawn-out build-ups and crescendos have a sense of purity that no other album could match. People call Spirit of Eden an album of the earth, an album of God. There is a community of people around this record that find genuine spirituality in its sound. Not to mention its fascinating backstory of band members locking themselves in a dark church to record the whole thing lit only by candles for weeks at a time. This is one of the most organic, spiritual records ever made. Number 2, The Life of Pablo by Kanye. The Life of Pablo is every Kanye album put together in one. It's uplifting, it's tormented, it's romantic, it's violent. It's Kanye's last great record. It's his most worldly and elevated work at the same time. Kanye is an artist whose talent is so great, he convinces people that they can participate in his greatness just by listening to him. He is the artist of our time, and this record is the ultimate manifesto for his career and the spirit of his music. Nothing he's made since then has reached the heights of The Life of Pablo. It feels like this is the one album where he says and does everything to the absolute maximum. Distortion, experimental sounds, sampled beats, beats, pop songs, it's all here. Maybe it's not his best album in terms of how focused and cinematic it is, but it really feels like the most essential Kanye that we'll ever get. Number one, my most favorite album of all time, my most listened to album, the most meaningful album in my life is Good Kid, Mad City by Kendrick. I've talked a lot about Good Kid, Mad City in the past. I believe it is one of the most defining American stories of the 21st century. The level of writing on this album gives it a scope like something out of ancient Greece. The protagonist battles evil forces while struggling to stay true to his mission. Good Kid, Mad City is an album for the ages, and it's my most listened to, most beloved, most meaningful album I've ever heard. All right, this is my full list, my favorite albums of all time. These are my most listened to albums, my favorite albums, the albums that I grew up with, the albums I still listen to this day, the things that I think are most meaningful, interesting. If you think I missed anything, if there's anything you think I need to hear, if you want to tell me my opinion sucks, leave a comment. But otherwise, thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you all very soon.